Has the United Nations actually failed to stop wars and maintain global peace? And if the system is now being challenged by the very powers that had built it in the first place after World War II, is the global order itself starting to crack? With over 60 armed conflicts worldwide and violence at its highest level since World War II, one question stands out. How effective is the United Nations today? I spoke with several pol science and international relations students to see how this generation views United Nations, its role, its limitation, and whether it still holds real power in today's world. Let's jump right in. What role do you think the United Nations plays in maintaining global peace?
Well, I believe the United Nations plays quite a crucial role in providing a forum of discussion, of diplomacy to nations to discuss their issues, to de-escalate conflict essentially.
It brings states around the world to cooperate in fields of security, economics, diplomacy, as well as bringing solution to problems like health and conflicts.
UN is the only institution that we have here in this today's world for peacekeeping, safeguarding all of us. But I think it lost its brightness. The peak, the golden era of UN right now.
I believe that the United Nations doesn't necessarily hold a role in its force or its power rather than its presence and influence. So they set the tone into what is the general knowledge, moral values. That doesn't necessarily mean that these countries in the UN would necessarily abide. However, it does create a space, and that is very vital for maintaining peace and justice.
How effective do you think the United Nations is in addressing climate change?
Yeah, I believe the United Nations is effective in providing a framework, in providing a legal basis to decisions, especially with climate change and the Paris Agreement. However, I don't think that these decisions made or the agreements that are signed off are enforced effectively. They're basically left to the agreement or to the will of the nations instead of having any binding value.
Fortunately enough, I believe that the climate issue is one of the issues where the UN has been much successful in, whether it be opening discussions or the Paris Agreement. It allowed even rival states to agree and have a common ground. And even if not much action has become, creating this space and taking a small step is very vital.
Their effectiveness comes from addressing the problems, bringing solution, but there's this dilemma of enforcement, where we had Paris Agreement, and the outcomes of the Paris Agreement were not binding. So I would say there's this limitation that exists right now. I would add even another point, which is there's that global north, global south divide about the reasons of these ecological problems we have today. So we're addressing the problems, but there's no solutions.
Can you name one major success and one failure of the United Nations in recent years?
Of small and developing nations, they again created a framework, a language, and a basis on how these nations are to address these issues. As for failures, I would have to say the ongoing Gaza crisis showed that the United Nations is not always effective.
The successes, one of them is that how countries came together and to cooperate in the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Even rivalry countries, they had coordination in terms of making vaccines and at the same time giving it to weaker states. And the failures, I would say the UN had problems in resolving conflicts around the world. Especially we see that we have been more than 2 years war in Ukraine and it wasn't fixed until today. Same thing in Gaza. Sudan, we have RSF and the US and the central government having conflicts between them. So I would say UN is not enforcing nothing since it doesn't have this enforcement mechanism.
The climate change agreement that they had, where UN had this conference, I think it was COP21, if I'm not mistaken, where they collected everyone to bring awareness on the climate change. Yeah, there were some problems where the United States withdrew and came back, but I think that was one of the success that we can say. The failures, the list goes and goes and goes and goes. We can see how insufficient they were with keeping the Palestinian lives. They did not have any resolutions to stop Israel. And the US was funding them. Have you seen Trump's speech in the Israeli parliament? He was like, he wanted this from me, he wanted the mission. That I never heard, but I just gave it to him. Like, you saying this publicly is even embarrassing. So we have the invasion of Iraq. UN did not accept it, but US did intervene in Iraq. We have conflict in Sudan, Congo, East Turkestan. Nobody's talking about these, and we're facing so many inequalities, so many injustices, but still UN fails to maintain the peace.
Well, the United Nations was born to prevent the creation of another world war, and we can say in that case that it was successful in preventing another world war to occur. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have succeeded in solving every other catastrophe in the world. For example, we have the case in Gaza, where they have failed to prevent what was ongoing right now, or the case in Ukraine. There are many cases where, even though they have discussed it, action was not taken.
In your opinion, how can the United Nations be reformed to better address the global challenges?
Yeah, I would say that reform needs to happen in the structure of the UN, especially the Security Council. I believe that it simply doesn't suit the world as it is today. It's still stuck in a post-World War II global order, and the world today needs more place for developing nations, for regional powers, for NGOs. I think all of these are not represented enough in the current structure of the UN.
I love this question. As we mentioned in the beginning, we said UN is one and only institution that we have. So I think it's important for us to reform. So I think to reform, we should either abolish or limit the veto powers, or add on veto powers. Like, why don't we have Arab countries have their own member in this security? Yeah, yes, representatives. Why not Latin America? Nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about Indonesia. Indonesia is one of the countries that has the highest Muslim population. Why is it not included? We should get something new or build something new. So I think a reform is a must.
I believe the UN reform doesn't necessarily start from the change in their structure. However, in the representation and courage, the UN needs to understand that it is not a 5-country post-World War club anymore. It is now working in a 21st century community, global community, which involves the global South, women, youth. So they need to understand that they need to work as a global community, not just a 5-country club.
What do you think is the biggest challenge facing the United Nations today?
I would say just the public image of the UN is quite tarnished. The public doesn't trust the UN as an unbiased forum. They see it more as a place where big nations can divide issues based on national interest. So I would say legitimacy is an issue, representation is another one. Especially with ongoing issues, I don't think that the regions where these issues are taking place are represented enough.
The biggest challenge, I would say, that is this legitimacy crisis. And there are many states that today think that UN as an entity is being dominated by powerful states. So maybe mostly these concerns come from Global South, and it hasn't been addressed.
The biggest challenge can be how the countries, especially the powerful countries, are not do not want to cooperate with one another. They all focus on their own self-interest and their own state interest. So that's why I think it makes hard for United Nations to bring them all together and to come up with a
Consensus.
solution. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that UN have.
I believe it is the trust and the reputation. Nations, especially the smaller nations from the global south, and many countries as well, right now, even in the global north, they have realized that the UN has not been able to hold accountability to what they say. And we can see that in many cases right today, such as the case in Congo and Sudan, in Ukraine, Gaza, and so on and so forth, where there is a lot of discussions going on, however, not much action.
How does the United Nations impact smaller or developing countries?
I think the role of the UN in this topic is quite important because it really is one of the only places where small and developing nations can voice their issues, they can present their problems, and have an audience that is there to listen to these problems, to suggest solutions, to vote on these issues. But again, how effective this is done, how unbiased this is done, it's up for discussion.
It is a hot topic. I would say that the UN, because of it's being dominated by these powerful countries, we see that the global north are bringing solution from their perspective to countries from the global south. So it truly contradicts with the local realities of these countries, making the decision-making process controversial. At the same time, you don't see like changing outcomes on the ground.
Regardless of their success in taking action, these small nations require a voice, require representation, and the UN does so by mentioning them, including them in discussions, and even little change, little representation does play a big role in these developing countries, and it is not to be taken lightly.
I think it impacts a lot, like especially with humanitarian aid, UNICEF, World Health Organizations. I do have friends that work there, and they put so much effort in helping those small and developing countries. But I think it is not enough. Yeah, of course, it won't be enough because there are so many countries that need this help. Like, yes, they are doing these aids and all that and facilities. They're building houses, hospitals, education centers. But at the end, I feel like it turned to a more symbolic thing rather than an action. Like more action is needed, I think.
Do you think the United Nations Security Council is still relevant today? Why or why not?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely still relevant. There is no real alternative to the Security Council. We don't have any other council or organization which could take the place of the UN today. However, like we've said, issues definitely remain. They need to be addressed.
I think we should look at it within the history. I think this system has been created after World War II. So, and five permanent member seats were given to the countries who won that war. So we could say it's outdated because the realities we had post World War and what we have today is totally different. We could say it's still relevant since it already exists. We still don't have an alternative.
Of course, it is still relevant because we have so many conflicts going around in the world. But I think Security Council has shifted its vision, let's say. But I think it's politically, morally kind of outdated in today's world. The aids are being like blocked.
For sure, it is relevant. The Security Council is created for a reason. However, morally, they are not relevant. Morally, they have not upheld what they initially stood for. However, the way it has been structured, where these 5 countries uphold veto, diminishes the whole global democracy, and which is what we need currently. And on top of that, we also have issues when these five veto countries disagree. For example, when how China and Russia would be on one side and the other 3 would be on the other team. This creates further discord.
Why has the United Nations Security Council repeatedly failed to prevent or stop major conflicts globally? Do you think it's a structural flaw or a political deadlock?
I think it's really both. I believe that the structure of the UN allows for political deadlock. I think it even encourages political deadlock, honestly speaking. If you give these nations veto powers, they're going to use them for their interest in these regions, and these structural issues, I believe, give forth these political deadlocks which make it harder to have swift and effective solutions, which is why these crises in different regions can go on and on without any authoritative voice speaking out.
I would say there's a bit of both. I would say there is a structural flaw. The structural flaw comes from the fact that we need more than 5 countries. And I think the Turkish president, once he addressed that the world is more than 5 countries. So we need to fix this by bringing more countries to the Security Council. I would say countries from Africa, Asia, Muslim world, Latin America have more inclusive involvement in decision making. And I think that it will be very effective to make resolutions for conflicts around the world.
I think it's both structural flaw and political deadlock. We can mention how the Israeli minister visiting Hungary and Hungary withdrawing from ICC. That shows how it's a structural flaw. And for the political deadlock, it's how the veto powers is creating this political deadlock, and we cannot have a solution.
I think it's both. The structure creates the deadlock. The veto allows certain nations to choose the luxury of when international law matters and when it does not. Until we are able to resolve this issue, we will continue to have issues with the UN, and there will always be conflicts. Until that changes, we will continue to see resolutions fail, not because it's incorrect, because it is not in the convenience of these 5 states.
If you had the power, how would you make the United Nations more effective?
I would focus on 2 aspects. I would try to democratize decision making, and I would give representation to regional actors, to the actors where these issues are actually happening in, because these nations or these groups, they know these issues better than anyone else. I don't believe they are fairly represented. I believe there's a lot of power play going on in these discussions. Smaller nations are usually either ignored, or their decisions, their votes, don't have as much weight as the bigger nations. So I believe focusing on, firstly, democratizing decision making and giving representation to the people or the nations who actually face these issues would be quite needed reforms.
I would say that we shift the decision-making power, from the UN and bring it to the other regions. So I would say we put more emphasis on the regional organization, the other regional organization created by the UN. For example, I'll give you a quick example. I would say IGAD, which is an organization in the East Africa. So I would rather the problems will be fixed in East Africa rather than it being in New York.
I think I would first add on regional representatives, as we mentioned, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and limit the veto powers. I don't think only the 5 permanent countries should have veto powers and have the fate for all
Making all decisions.
Yeah, making all the decisions. And the other one can be how we have observers, right? And observer countries, and I think that should be fixed as well. Like we had Palestine, I think, as an observer. Why not make it a country?
I would make it independent and less afraid to call out the powerful countries for what they are, whether it be corruption, occupation, war crimes, genocide. And I would connect the UN Institute, with civil societies and youth movements, because change does not start from boardrooms.
If you could ask the United Nations Secretary General one question, what would that be?
I would ask him about the tension between moral decision making and political interest in these decisions, how he balances them, how he makes sure that the decisions made don't represent the national interest, but address these issues effectively.
I think it would be a very good opportunity to have such thing. And I would say, how can we assure that the UN will be neutral, at the same time is credible, in a time where powerful states have much influence in the system? So how can we fix this dilemma? I think this question needs to be answered.
I think I would ask him, what can we do to make United Nations more independent and for them to act faster than they are doing right now? To have more stable, more equal, more diverse, and more a peaceful world.
How do you justify staying silent or neutral in the face of injustice for the people who are being silenced, when it's your sole role to be the voice of the voiceless?